Hello, everyone, and welcome to a very special edition of Familiar with the Matter. Recently, I live streamed a corporate panel discussion regarding employee resource groups, or ERGs. As a result of that broadcast, a viewer contacted me saying they had direct experiences with ERGs in their workplace and wondered if I might want to speak with them about it, and I most certainly did. Now, obviously, unlike past editions of Familiar with the Matter, this will not be a live discussion, because for the sake of their privacy, I have removed any identifying avatars and have as well altered their voice. I found the conversation to be very enlightening, given the perspective I came into it based on the videos I have done on or about ERGs in the past, and I hope you will find it of some benefit as well. All that being said, let's begin. All right, mystery person, tell me, how long have you been in the industry that you are currently in?
I've been in my industry about 10 years.
All right, so 10 years, so a decade's long of work in this. Now, when did employee resource groups start becoming initiated into your workplace?
I think they actually started before I started at my job, but they've only become prominent in the last 10 years.
So, when you started there, what role did they play in your everyday work for the most part up until recently?
So you had to go out of your way to find them, at least when I started. At this point, they're much more prominent and they'll send invitations to people to join these groups and also to come and see what they have to say.
And what was your understanding when you started there as to the utility of employee resource groups, if you were aware of them really at all?
The utility is both for the company and for the employees. For the company, it gives them deeper market penetration, the same way that a company could do Chinese New Year type advertisements at that time. They could do the same thing for Pride Month or for Women's Month and that sort of thing. For the employee, there's utility. If people are looking for resources for mentorship and stuff like that, they can go through their employee resource group. They can find people that are of a similar demographic, or like at least that mindset oriented.
Okay, so did you understand them to be more like, I don't know, support groups, or just sort of like, I mean, what did you think of them? I mean, I guess, how long were you at your job before they became as prominent, or maybe, for lack of a better word, problematically prominent as they are now? Like, how many years went by before they suddenly bubbled up the way they are now?
It's probably around 2014 or 15 that they started becoming very prominent.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say that they're problematic or that they were problematic at that point, but certainly as they've become bigger.
Did you join one yourself at any point?
Yes, I did. I joined two groups. I joined the women's group first, and then I joined the LGBT group second, and I've since been kicked out of the LGBT group.
Okay, so when you join now, not to get too personal necessarily, but do you personally fall into the demographics that these two ERGs represent?
For the women's group, no. I'm not a woman, but I joined with the understanding that I could become a member and hear what they have to say. I have since been corrected, or at least they have done announcements to say that there are members and there are allies, to say that women are members and men are allies only. I have clarified to them that I consider myself a member and not an ally, but they've never corrected me, and they, continue to send me invitations to conferences, to events, and stuff like that. So as far as I know, I'm still a member of that group, but I don't talk to them anymore.
Yeah, that was something that I learned in the little panel discussion I looked at, is that there are stratifications apparently within the ERGs of member versus ally or something like that. And so do you notice, or are aware of any functional difference in treatment, or I don't know, participation between those two levels, at least in the groups that you're in?
For the women's group, yes. When I was still an active participant in their activities, they had an invitation for on International Women's Day to go to a speaker. The tickets were, I don't know, $50 a piece. They advertised that members could ask or put their name in to get a ticket. I put my name in and didn't hear anything back one way or the other. So I ended up buying my own ticket and yeah, ended up going to see this speaker on International Women's Day who gave a very cool presentation, but I was the only man in the room. And I think one of the funny things in that is the speaker talking about donating $100,000 of her own money towards a cause that was important to her, which I think is great. But I wondered to myself when I would ever have that amount of liquid cash ever in my lifetime.
Yeah.
All the women in the room were VPs or something to that effect. So I was a lowly employee among many people, and I was the only person to pay my own way.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that in the panel discussion they talked about was the purpose of ERGs was to make employees feel, what's the phrase? They can bring their authentic self to work or their whole self to work or something. Did you feel at any point in this process that you were pressured to join ERGs, or that to not join an ERG was somehow an internal faux pas?
Not yet. It's different for management, I think, but for employees, there isn't any pressure at this point. But as you rise to the ranks, going through management into the executive team, it becomes less and less viable for someone to avoid getting into any of the political stuff, or at least like not having a signature project or something like that they have. So for someone who doesn't have something super special to pin to their chest or something like that, they don't have a feather in their cap, then they would join an ERG in order to show that they're still engaged with social causes.
Okay, and if you can, just for clarification, if you know off the top of your head, how many ERGs are in your company and what areas do they represent?
There is, let's see, there's one for autism, there's one for the LGBT, one for women, one for veterans, one for Native Canadians, and I think there's at least one more, but I can't remember it off the top of my head. But yeah, even though I am autistic, I did not join the autism group.
Well, now, why wouldn't you do that? I mean, it seems like that's the entire purpose, to find resources and, people who share your, let's say, issue, for lack of a better word. Why wouldn't you join the autism ERG?
It was actually only after I had joined and gotten kicked out of the LGBT one that I found out that I had autism. So I hadn't had a great experience with ERGs at this point, and I didn't think that I would get a very different experience joining the autism group.
Okay, so I guess now the big question is, what did you do to get kicked out of the LGBTQ group?
So I had some friction with the group even after joining. I think it was after my first meeting that I got a very pointed question from one of the co-heads of my provincial group asking what exactly I meant by saying I have a different perspective. Because I think I ended the call by saying, hey, I'm glad to be here. I have a different perspective from most of you, but I'm happy to be here and happy to work with you. And yeah, I got a pointed email asking what exactly it meant by that. From that point, I got a lot of guidance from my manager and director saying I was being too negative, that I had too negative a point of view, that I was too identifiable as being against things. I joined the LGBT group after the Jordan Peterson stuff, talking about pronouns and saying I don't want to use someone else's directed pronouns, but I'm happy to work with you, happy to consider you my colleague, happy to solve customer solutions. So I had not much success being negative, but as soon as I started being really positive and finding or thinking of solutions that we could do to get forward is when I started getting in trouble. The thing that got me kicked out was sending in a question during a town hall type meeting saying, in the case of an impasse when an employee demands that someone else uses their pronoun, and let's say it's me saying no, my suggestion would be that the policy be focus on whatever the customer needs and then walk away. Solve whatever problem is impacting the customer or impacting the internal customer, and then walk away from the conversation and just simply consider that pronoun issue not important. After a few days of them considering that question, they kicked me out.
Yeah, because I've always wondered, and especially after that panel discussion, are the ERGs for the benefit of the company or are they for the benefit of the employee? And what I mean by that is it's like it's an employee resource group. So you'd think it'd be a completely internal thing, as some just sort of like, oh, if you like this particular thing, you can find information for it here. But I mean, the company's paying people for their time in doing this, and so I would assume there's some kind of bottom line, best practices, some kind of goal that these things are supposed to be ultimately reaching for. I mean, certainly the employees to make them feel welcome and are supported, but ultimately something for the benefit of the company. So is it? I mean, it sounds like it's not so much about, hey, how can we group together our common experiences into something that'll be beneficial for the company in serving this demographic, more than it's like, I don't know. It sounds more like cliques than it does sound like work groups. Is that how your experience has been?
Yeah, absolutely. In the question of whether or not it benefits the employee or the company, I think a better way to look at the question would be like looking at a union. Is the union there to serve the employee or the company? And ultimately, it's not even nefarious, but the union is there to service the union. Just like the ERG is there to service the ERG's interests, not necessarily the company's or the employees. That might not have been the intention when they were formed, but the ERG certainly has its own interests and it is its own entity. It does serve interests of the company and it does serve interests of the employee, but it does have its own agenda as well.
Well, it sounds like most of the things that it does serve for the company and/or the employee seem almost secondary in consideration to the integrity of the ERG itself. And I guess maybe that's unavoidable when you're talking about forming groups around specific, I don't know, shared elements or something. But I don't know. Does the company? Do you think this company sacrifices something in the time that is allotted to people doing ERG activities or setting aside their actual work responsibilities to serve the ERG?
Sort of, yes. It's not so much the time that's like if someone sets aside their own time, they're a management professional and they can get all their projects done then they either on their own time or during time that they've set aside during their workday if they can work on this, or if they're an hourly wage employee and they're able to schedule time to work on these. The company does give something up, but the company gets more out of it than they give up. And I also don't want to suggest that the ERGs are taking the company for a ride, but the way the company looks at it is they give something up and they get more of the ERG, and the ERG probably looks at it the same way, that they're getting more out of it than the company is.
Okay, so as an example, what does the company get out of, or what do you understand the company gets out of the LGBTQ group, as an example?
For one thing, it gets higher engagement out of employees that happen to fall into ideology is the wrong word, but the same kind of mindset that the specific LGBT group is, as opposed to people that happen to be sexual minorities. But this as a social clique, the company gets more engagement out of someone that joins that and then finds like-minded people. The company also gets deeper market penetration, like I said before, that they can get people that know how to advertise to people of that same social clique, as opposed to, again, just simple sexual minorities that happen to live in the community.
Well, but then isn't there a danger that if the group is labeled as we serve this demographic, but internally they start developing their own rigid ideology, that certainly the company's getting something out of it because they have effectively ideological zealots pushing forward something that from anyone on the outside looks like a positive thing, but internally it's kind of, I don't know, it sounds a bit cannibalistic.
It is a little cannibalistic, but because a lot of this stuff is closed doors or happening just through email, it's not like the public sees it, and that's also a good thing. Because similar cannibalistic stuff will happen just through normal business, like people are jockeying for positions and stuff like that. It's not. It's probably not the worst that people are trying to drive an agenda, because again, like normal business stuff, people have agendas, including things that are selfish and things that harm the company. But I think for the most part, these people are sincere that they want to benefit the company, but they do so through pushing the interests of their social clique.
Oh, I mean, throughout my experience thus far, looking at and commenting on all these wonderful social movements, I rarely get the notion that anybody's doing it in the intention of being mean or destructive or something. That seems sometimes just to come out from, the natural course of things. So, you know, ill intent is really anything I think about. But when it comes to a corporation, I mean, and I can think of similar things I've seen in my experience, like work teams or sales teams. You put a chart up on the wall and says this team did this team did this, and you set competition. I mean, that benefits the corporation. The corporation is a non-human entity that looks at the bottom line. So if there's some quote unquote healthy competition or some passion in some work groups that push forward certain, I don't know, PR aspects, that's all beneficial for the company. It doesn't cost them effectively anything. But I wonder about what does that do to employee morale. I mean, it's one thing. Again, I haven't been in a company yet that has had ERGs, so I'm completely blank on this. But it seems that there's something different between putting a number up on a wall and says, "Can we hit the sales goal?" versus setting up these little crucibles of identity politics in some instances that require the employees to delve into something that isn't directly work related but entwines their personal life into work. I just feel like there's a danger of the erosion of professional distance. Do you see any of that in your company so far?
From the ERGs, not yet. It's mostly the people from the ERGs that there could be problems with.
What do you mean? What do you mean by people from the ERGs versus in the ERGs? I don't understand.
Okay, so if you're an employee that just keeps their head down and just does their work all day, you will probably not notice ERGs, even though you'll get communications from them or invitations from them. They have not invaded your work at this point. But the people who work in these ERGs, they have their everyday jobs as well. You could run into someone like this that 99% of your interaction with this person is work related, but if you had legitimate criticism for them, something they did wrong, or feedback that they are not interested in hearing, they can weaponize their identity to say you're picking on me because of X.
Oh.
And there aren't very many of these people, but there are some people with chips on their shoulder. Where someone could, like, the threat doesn't even need to come up. This person doesn't even need to explicitly say it. But because someone is black or trans or something like that, it could be difficult to criticize this person because of fears that they could simply say that they're being discriminated against. I've never run into this situation personally, but I've heard secondhand.
Okay, so by making certain identity aspects prominent, they then also become swords and shields, depending on the person. It's not necessarily inherent.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just regular jockeying for management professionals and for employees, but they're able to use a side of themselves that most people don't or aren't able to because of of the social landscape with the whole idea that like, oh, the weakest person should be raised up the most, or the person who is most oppressed should have the largest voice.
This is tacitly approved by the fact the company promotes ERGs in the first place based on those kind of demographics.
Yes, it is tacitly approved by the company because the company also has its own social goals. If it has, let's say, a goal of getting 50% of the executive team being women by year 2025 or something like that, then it would tacitly approve of things the women's ERG would do in order to meet that goal or like to push that agenda.
Do you think and again, you've seen this as an evolving process. Do you think the company is, and I'm just imagining, I'm sort of gaming it out of my head, like over time how this works out, that the company would effectively start ceding its management authority to the power of the ERGs to set the agenda, but all going off in divergent directions?
Maybe in terms of the social policy and what the company does when it's engaging with the community, but not in terms of the core business yet. My worry is that the company will decide what communities to expand into or what areas to focus in terms of rolling out new products and stuff like that. If it's doing so at the advantage of one of these social cliques at the expense of its existing customers. But yeah, so far the core business isn't affected by the ERGs.
So the danger that the ERGs will become internal focus groups that are given more credence than perhaps actually talking to the customers?
Or just talking to normal employees, like employees as a whole.
Do you think ERGs help, hinder, or otherwise neutral to employee morale in the long run?
I think in the long run, it probably hurts employee morale, but because the rollout of them has been so slow, I don't think people really notice them. And in the end, because they're not involving themselves in the day-to-day operations, I think that people don't see the disadvantage to them. It's much easier to downplay any disadvantages.
Okay, and so what is, so far that you've seen, the worst or the most, let's say, troubling aspect to an ERG that they've gotten away with it? Let's say it's the worst thing you can think of so far that wasn't corrected because once you start giving ground on certain things, someone else is going to replicate it to see if they can get away with it. That's just the nature of stuff, whether it's now or a year from now. So what is the biggest danger that has actually happened, do you think, as an example of something that will inevitably become a problem if it's not put into check?
So conflicts of interest, I would say, is the biggest problem. Conflicts of interest have always existed, not just in my company, but every single company that's ever existed. Things like nepotism and cronyism have always been a thing in every single company. But the kinds of conflicts of interest that ERGs produce it's at least affected, like it has a component of ideological, like it has the social clique element to it, where it's like someone is part of my group, therefore I'm going to defend them. Or I'm a member of this group, therefore I'll overlook this conflict. The problem isn't, like the biggest problem isn't so much in everyday conflicts of interest, like I hired my son, or I hired my buddy, or is my buddy's nephew, or something like that. It's something, a scale above that, where this conflict has already taken place, or a perceived conflict has taken place, and that you bring it to the people that oversee ethical conflicts, and that person has an ethical conflict that they're not willing to overlook, or sorry, that they will overlook because they're also a member of that group.
Yeah, you've got these hierarchies within the hierarchy that might take precedence because of the sensitive nature, let's say, of the ERG. Like if it's something, I mean, because if you go to a support group, which is effective, I mean, and I've always kind of seen it that way, at least as far as the branding of these things, is when I see promotions about ERGs, Now, that panel discussion talked about community outreach, and I hadn't really considered that aspect of it before, but that kind of made sense to me. It's like, okay, you can, have special programs or do special events or something surrounding this particular demographic that might be beneficial to the company and or the community, depending on the circumstance. Like, okay, that seems like, harmless enough, even though it's one of those things where I kind of think, well, is it also a Trojan horse kind of deal? But okay, fine. But then I think about, like I said, you've got cliques inside the company which are overseen only by the cliques. And anybody trying to come in and criticize anything that's going on there, as you said, their demographic theme, for lack of a better word, becomes something that sort of insulates them from a lot of either people even approaching them in the first place or any criticism that comes their way. And so do the ERGs then, if you have these, small little hierarchies that cross and overlap with what should be the kind of hierarchy in the company, is that going to become more of a problem? Are you going to see more ethical lapses and conflicts of interest over time as these groups become more entrenched into the company versus the actual company hierarchy?
I think so. I think that you'll inevitably see more of these conflicts, but something that I guess I should clarify is that I'm not meaning to suggest that if I've made a complaint or I put in a question to an ethics department saying, I think that something untoward has happened with this gay employee, and the fact that they're gay is really besides the point. I'm not worried that the person overseeing that complaint will be gay themselves and that they'll overlook it because of that, but that both members will be part of the LGBT social clique. And the person will overlook it because of that.
Right.
If that makes more sense.
Well, I mean, whether it's LGBT, I mean, anything. It's like, oh, well, he's my buddy down at the, at the volunteer fire department, and I know him better than anybody else, and he wouldn't do something like that. I just imagine that, but it's inside an already established hierarchy. It's sort of like having secret groups inside the military, or like I think of the movie The Skulls. You ever see The Skulls?
I haven't, but I'm guessing that's the Skulls and Crossbones.
Yes, it's a movie that's sort of influenced or inspired by Skull and Bones, and how that secretive group gives everybody sort of certain privileges if you're in there versus if you're not, the in group out group kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I don't know. Like I say, it's alien to me because I haven't seen it yet. But everything that I think about the possible problems down the line, or how fervently the company promotes these groups as some kind of not only a recruitment tool, like, look, we have a group just for your demographic, but also like making identity or aspects of identity more prominent or more important than individuality. That's the thing that always worries me about that, especially within a company structure. Because like I said, the insidious notion I see with ERGs and a lot of the promotion of bringing your whole self to work, that particular phrase, your authentic self to work, I always see it as sort of a very, and again, I'm maybe more conspiratorial on this. I game it out to its extremist degree. Like, if I'm never not at work, the company always benefits. You know what I mean? If my life, if my regular everyday outside of the office life is now an integral part of my operation at work, I can never leave. And I'm always on the job. I'm always promoting the product. I'm always in some way, shape, or form tied to this thing. And there was this one video I did several months back, or maybe actually I guess it was about a year ago now, where the promotional video was so pushing this idea that they were a family, that we're a family. And I'm like, that sounds unhealthy. That just sounds ultimately unhealthy, especially if you're effectively highlighting someone's identity versus who they are and trying to commingle all that together. It sounds not only sort of dangerous for the company's fortunes, but also sounds dangerous for the company and the people therein, because like I said in that video, it's like, what if you end up having to fire your family member, and then you've got all the people around that are part of their ERG? how do you handle a conflict that comes up where you have a group that has become so intertwined in their personal selves and identity, and then somebody has to be let go because of just reasonable reasons? What do you do in that situation? How does that operate? I can't imagine, because trying to think of my coworkers as family in that way doesn't click with me. Now, you've seen how things have evolved over 10 years. Do you think that they've reached a level of equilibrium, or do you think that they're only going to become more of a problem or not in the future?
I'm not sure if they'll become a problem, but I think that their prominence will continue to grow. A few things in the stuff that you mentioned, I definitely have heard the phrase "bring your whole self to work," and I personally don't feel comfortable bringing my whole self to work. One of the things is that I do oppose some of this the progressive ideas being pushed, and the idea that if you're not progressive, then you don't belong. I think that that runs completely counter to the idea that you're bringing your whole self to work. But yeah, your idea that if you're bringing your whole self to work, that you're always working is absolutely true. I don't think that the company necessarily intends for people to be working all the time, but I do think that the company, if an employee hears a conversation talking about the company, then they want that employee to be comfortable and like not just comfortable, but they should want to jump into the conversation and say good things about the company. Not to ask for a turf, but to legitimately promote the company where it's exceeding. But yeah, in terms of working all the time, if someone's working in one of these ERGs, then a lot of their time is volunteered, and that's time the company isn't paying for. And that's time that the company is benefiting from because of the community outreach, the engagement, and the deeper market penetration. So yeah, they're getting something out of it for basically nothing.
Yeah, I didn't even consider the volunteer aspect of it, because I'm always thinking like, oh, someone's taking their time out of the workday to do this stuff for the ERG. But yeah, there is, I mean, the whole idea of doing community outreach and everything. They're not getting paid for that. That's just they're volunteering on behalf of a group inside the company, and the company's. I'm presuming the company's giving some kind of resources for them to draw down on to do such things, but their time, their labor is effectively donated.
Yes, absolutely. The other thing too is I don't think it's exactly intentional, but it's like the company has monetized the idea that the personal is political.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's like they see the ERGs promoting this, and they see we can get something out of this. And it's not like an insidious thing. Just like the ERGs trying to get something out of the company isn't insidious, but both competing interests think that they can get more out of the other than the other.
Well, yeah, I don't imagine that anything. And again, this is going back to the idea the corporation is not ultimately run by people so much as it's run by profit motive. Even the most altruistic company has to make money, and so yeah, I mean maybe it's not insidious, but to a certain extent it is a little bit cynical that you're taking. I mean, I'm trying to think of a better word for it, but you're effectively preying on someone's personal life outside of simply their job duties in order to make money for the company, while sort of wrapping it in this support group, community outreach thing. But really, you're taking advantage of their demographic for PR purposes. Even though their demographic doesn't necessarily say anything about who they are as a person. And I guess the funny thing is, though, when they talk about ERGs, we want you to bring your whole self to work, but we only care about these very specific aspects to your makeup or your personality. Anything else is kind of set by the wayside. Oh, by the way, if you're not somehow a member of one of these particular demographics, you don't get your own group. That was one of the funny things in that panel discussion where the lady said, this one woman approached her and said, "Well, can I start a religious ERG?" And this is amazing, and I don't think I misheard her. You can go back; it's a 19 minutes on that panel discussion in the video, thereabouts. She says, "Well, you don't wear your cross outside your shirt, so if you're not, if it's not obvious, if it's not something that people can see, then you probably don't qualify for an ERG or something." I'm like, so you have to have something obvious. How obvious is someone's sexuality, right? Or how obvious is someone's, I don't know, veteran status or whatever? It's short of like having a war wound or a Purple Heart you're wearing all the time. It's so bizarre to me. When you get down to the granular details of it, of like who is represented and who feels like they belong, um, especially if you have a different idea but you share a similar demographic, like what happened with you in the LGBTQ group.
Yeah, it's pretty funny in that regard because, yeah, religion and sexuality are essentially the same in that regard, where it's like, unless you're wearing something on your sleeve, then how could someone tell whether you're gay or Christian or you're Muslim or whatever? Um, and yeah, but wearing stuff on your sleeve and going back to chips on shoulders, I've been asked by my management to start referring to one of my team members on my floor, who's not part of my team, but again, they work on the floor, to go by they, them pronouns, where I see this person as a she, her. And my position has been this person is an esteemed colleague. I'm happy to help her with whatever problems she has. I'm not going to use pronouns directed by someone else, but how I feel this person is irrelevant. There's nothing wrong with her. She doesn't have a chip on her shoulder. If she personally came up to me and asked me, "Hey, can you use these pronouns?" I would at least consider it in that case.
Yeah,
But
yeah. I remember I talked about this on a video one time, as I do so many things. I had a friend who several years ago who began to transition, and we knew him as John, for lack of a better for a name. And over the course of time, it was just a matter of changing our understanding that they wanted to be called Jane. And there was a period of transition, but this is somebody I had a personal relationship with. This wasn't just some stranger or some kind of like guessing game I had to do. I knew this person, and so it became very easy for me and the rest of us over time to just. I mean, I remember not too long ago I came across a picture of Jane, and it took me a minute to remember. Oh yeah, that used to be John, because it was just so natural to it. It's just a polite kind of thing if it's somebody that you know. But as a widespread rule that you have to be walking around on eggshells on the off chance you say the wrong thing about someone when they're not even around, because you're not usually looking at someone directly and saying her or he or something. They're looking at them and looking at the person. But I guess the other thing too, in that, and just bringing that up, I wonder, and I'm always curious, and I've always asked this on my videos, when you start instituting programs like this internally, not to mention what you're ever doing in your hiring practices, aren't you risking a legal peril of, just the inevitable discrimination of there's not a group for my demographic, you're not going to give me a group for my demographic, that's discrimination. If there's not enough employees of X demographic that qualify for this, well, why is that the threshold? Doesn't this set up landmines? I mean, it just seems to me that it would.
yeah, they've entered gray area in that regard. It's not black and white where it's like they definitely violated the law or they've definitely done something unethical by letting some demographics create a social group and then some demographics not create a social group, or people who want to make a social group or one of these ERGs rather, because I'm sure that there's informal social groups too, but a formal ERG around a certain idea. I've at least asked them about creating one around doing presentations and logic and stuff like that, and I was outright denied. I'm pretty sure that if I tried to create an ERG around type of work, that would also be denied. It doesn't seem like there's any specific criteria for creating new ones or why they would deny something apart from them considering whether or not it aligns with their political and social views. The people who govern these ERGs, anyways.
Yeah, well, that just says more about what can be monetized and what can't be. Like, and like you say, like professional workflow is not an ERG. It's got to be something about the employee. It has to be something that's more broad based that we can turn into an outreach kind of thing. So if your community had a large population of chess players, maybe you get away with a chess club or something. I guess I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's the way it should be. If a lot of employees are chess players, I think that and a lot of your community are chess players, I think that there'd be an advantage to creating an ERG around that. Just like I think that people trying to get better at making presentations, that there would be advantages to both the employee and the company to making an ERG around making presentations. The same way there's an advantage to encouraging people to join Toastmasters.
So could you expand more on as safely as you can, obviously for the sake of identification, but what the circumstances of the conflict of interest were and how that became a red flag for you?
So I submitted a question to the independent ethics board to ask whether the company factoring diversity in hiring practices, with there being a message at the bottom of the application saying diversity is important to us, with me thinking that in some way they're factoring someone's demographic into a hiring decision, me asking whether that would be ethical or not, and then being told no, that's not unethical, and then discovering the person that answered the question was a member of one of these ERGs, specifically one of the governors of this ERG. So my question was, how do you justify not recusing yourself? And this person justified not recusing themselves because they determined there was no ethical conflict. Does that make any sense to you? Because it doesn't make sense to me.
No, it doesn't make any sense at all. And the fact that they, I mean, the first giant red flag is that if I'm understanding you correctly, they said there was no issue with considering someone's whatever demographic in a hiring decision.
Yeah, because it's been a few years here, and I haven't done a lot of thinking about it in the last couple of years. Yeah, I think it was one ethical question to say, is it ethical to consider someone's demographics in these hiring decisions if you're saying that diversity is factored in? And then my second ethical complaint slash question was, how is it justified for this person to make this ruling? And then I believe the same person saw that question too, and they wrote it off.
Did you, I mean, that you know of, did you suffer any backlash because of these complaints or questions?
I didn't, but I did end up identifying myself instead of doing it anonymously, and I ended up, I guess you could call it escalation. I escalated the issue, but not through an official means. It was through telling my manager and director that the shareholders and/or the public would hear about this if it wasn't fixed. And so the ethical conflict was removed, even though the underlying mechanism wasn't fixed.
Okay, so the person was taken out of the process, but the question of whether or not you're hiring people with a filter of, name your demographic probably does still exist.
Yeah, exactly. So someone higher up in that chain took over both the questions and then answered them. Whether or not the answers were satisfactory to me or not is really irrelevant because they removed the person who was a conflict of interest. So again, like I feel like they resolved that conflict even though they didn't actually fix the problem.
Right. It was treating the symptom and not the cause kind of thing.
Yeah, so I mean, they disarmed one landmine.
Right.
Good job.
Yeah, and this goes into a different topic, obviously, but the whole diversity and inclusion initiative and the inherent discrimination necessary to make some of these goals that they state come to be, it's always fascinated me. I don't really have another way of putting another word for it. It's just fascinating because it seems so antithetical to just what I have been brought up to believe what social progress has been over the last 50 or 60 years, at least especially in America. And to see it now being promoted as a good thing to set something other than a person's personal merit higher in the consideration for employment or for promotion. Uh, and that's why the ERGs seem to be an outgrowth of making excuses to why it's not bad to highlight these things in particular. Because the more that you normalize categorizing people on things that have nothing to do with who they are, but more what they are. And now there are exceptions, obviously, like the veterans group in a lot of companies that have ERGs for veterans. It's one of the few instances where what puts you in that group is on the basis of something you did or an experience that you went through. An aspect of merit. Whereas if you're a woman, if you're gay, I mean, some might argue that being a particular religion isn't really a choice depending on the household you're brought up in, but still, it doesn't say anything about what kind of worker you are or who you are. Uh, do you think that ERGs like this or the culture that's built up around ERGs make, I don't know, beneficial discrimination more permissible?
Yes, absolutely. That is exactly one of the things that they push. Um, One of the things that you'll hear a lot, and I've heard you talk about it in your videos, talking about diversity of thought, where on a surface level, diversity of thought sounds great until you realize that their idea of diversity of thought is demographical diversity and an alignment of thought and homogeny of thought, where they'll look at a room, they'll look at their boardroom and say, we don't have any brown people here. We better hire some brown people so we know what brown people are thinking. And when you bring up that this is profoundly racist, that they maybe should hire people based on how well they interview or their quirks or what they bring to the table. And I don't know whether it's a short circuit in their brains or whether it's a blind spot to them, but when you bring up the idea that hiring women to get the women's opinion is profoundly sexist, they don't see what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean the assigning of a quality of thinking to someone on the basis of external elements, their skin color, their gender, or even things that aren't necessarily external, like their religion or their orientation. I've brought up this example many times. A a bearded white man who's also a carpenter. Am I talking about Jesus Christ or am I talking about serial killer Israel Keys? These elements do not define the quality of the person, or certainly not the quality or kind of their thinking. And yeah, you're right. I mean, obviously, I hear this stuff all the time. I watch video after video, corporation after corporation, educator after educator, assigning a quality of thought to people on the basis of what they look like. And I was brought up to believe that that's not how you assess people. You don't look at somebody and say, oh, they are this, therefore they must think differently than blah, or they must think like this. Yeah, you're right. It's never made sense to me how someone can say that in the same breath and also say that they're for diversity in someone's whole self, etc. Yeah, it to this moment boggles my mind.
Yeah, it's like the idea that Apple executive brought up that you could have 12 white, blue-eyed, blonde board members that are all incredibly diverse. And that statement would both be confusing and offensive to these ERGs.
Yeah, and she got what? She got fired for that, basically.
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, asking people that work in these ERGs, like explaining it step by step, saying, do you actually believe this? And say, of course we do.
Yeah, well, like I said, it just I, I have a hard time understanding that mindset. Yeah, I don't know. Like I say, it practically makes me speechless because it's just so the cognitive dissonance that you have to accept within yourself to move through the world and operate in that way, and think that you're interacting with other people in a way that is better than someone who assesses people individually. I like I say, it just doesn't make any sense to me. And the very fact that that mentality is nurtured and promoted and celebrated in companies and schools, etc. It's a very scary thought to me, and that it seems to be the norm now and something that everybody is for.
Yeah, I think that it's not so scary that it's just the company that promotes this, but it's also the people that are responsible for governing these activities in these groups. But it's not just those people as well, but it's also unions, and it's very vocal groups in the community too that all promote this. So you have a union member that are responsible for defending someone. They don't necessarily see the problem with discipline towards someone who is not progressive. And if you're a lesbian, let's say, it's easier to become prominent in the union because they're all very progressive as well. And there can be implications that you're just opposing me because of this or that.
Right. Because if you make the standout feature of celebration of someone one particular aspect of their makeup, then that also becomes the thing that they obviously must be criticized for if anything happens. Because it becomes all encompassing. Like, this person's identity no longer is their first name and the things they have done. It's, here's the lesbian.
Yeah, and none of this even needs to be spoken. It's just a landmine that both people can see and one person benefits from.
Okay, well, I'm again in another place where is there anything else that you wanted to mention or anything that we hadn't covered?
Just pretty much the same idea that um, I'm happy to work with anybody so long as we're both focused on solving the technical issue or making the most value as we can for customers. It doesn't make sense to me to even introduce identity into the equation. Um, yeah, I can't think of much more to say other than I haven't seen every single ERG, haven't talked to every ERG member, and most of the people are very sincere and they honestly think that they're doing good to the world and good for the company. But there are people with chips on their shoulders who are absolutely using their identity, and they don't care if this costs the company or they're willing to downplay any costs.
All right, well, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Subscribe.
I want to thank my guest very much for their time and their insight on ERGs. Now, if you have any questions for the speaker, please leave them in the comments below, and I will pass them along and then return with whatever feedback they might have. And, as always, thank you for listening.